Hello again. The Practical Animal Channel is dedicated to the public understanding of conservation. The channel raises this awareness by reaching out to interview conservationists. These are their stories. The channel showcases what they do and highlights the skill set they need. Through these recorded interviews, they highlight where our knowledge gaps lie and suggest projects for students. Today's guest is a field biologist and expert on red-tailed hawks. Jobs with red-tailed hawks include being a display giver, rehabilitator, educator, field biologist, pest controller, and evolutionary biologist. Bryce Robinson is a PhD candidate at Cornell in the USA, soon to qualify as an evolutionary biologist. I began by asking him about his most treasured possession in his field kit, and then we proceeded through the skills needed to be a raptor biologist, and we ended on project ideas for aspiring bird of prey handlers. What's your most treasured possession in your field kit?
Well, in my field kit, I have to probably say my binoculars. I mean, without my binoculars, I feel like as far as observation, especially for raptors, binoculars are, I think, number one on my priority list. And without them, I would be pretty sad.
Now, Bryce, for people who don't know, you can explain it far better than I can, despite the bit of research that I've done on what you do. So please, can you describe what do you do?
That's another hard question. I do a lot of different things. As far as my research goes, what I'm focused on currently is trying to understand the ecology and evolution, broadly speaking, of why we see different color types in raptors within a certain population. So red-tailed hawks in particular are not uncommon among the raptors in that you can see at any given location in the western part of the distribution birds that are dark in coloration, chocolatey color, for instance, and then birds that are really light in coloration. And there's been a lot of work that's tried to understand why we might see that pattern in raptors. That has resulted in a lot of different explanations. And so my work is trying to understand, kind of bring all those explanations together into a common theme. And then in red-tailed hawks in particular, try and understand the genetic mechanisms that might be behind how such variation develops, as a first step in putting together the picture of how it developed and then why we still see it in a species.
Are you an evolutionary biologist, Bryce?
In training, yes. I'm working into that. That's pretty much where I'm focused for my dissertation. So I've, throughout my career so far, I've been very much a field biologist and focused on life history and such things. But as I've learned more about relationships, I'm really into bird diversity. As I've learned more about the relationships, taxonomy, and systematics, I've gotten more into understanding how such diversity develops. And so it's kind of geared me into more of an evolutionary side of my research.
So, in a nutshell, your research is on the reasons for color variation in raptors, focusing on red-tailed hawks.
Yeah, I'm also doing some work on eastern screech owl, which in owls, they show similar patterns, but in a different way. A lot of owls have a red and a gray morph. So I'm just trying to pinpoint the areas on the genome that are responsible for those color types, again, as a first step into understanding when that pattern developed in owls, and why we see it so commonly throughout the whole order.
The channel is for aspiring life science students to watch to gain insight from interviews with conservation professionals to hopefully give them focus on where they want their career to go, the kind of information that I wanted when I was 20. Bryce, why is your research on colour variation in raptors, owls, red-tailed hawks, why is it important?
I don't think pure science is a very good way to put it, but it's definitely not directly focused on conservation objectives, right? But I think it, and other things like it, evolutionary work in general, is extremely important for conservation work. As far as understanding polymorphism, which is this multiple color types within a population, as far as understanding that and why it's important for things like conservation, there's actually a pattern that we see in birds that have this, that they're generally more common and widespread in their distributions, and there's fewer of them that are threatened or of conservation concern than we would expect. So there might be something about this trait that makes them more resistant to things that might cause population declines in species that are more, monomorphic or have smaller population sizes and such things. So I think that my work is important because it is investigating something that might be fundamental for understanding key aspects about raptor biology, but in a more 30,000 foot view of it, it's just giving us more information for how diversity develops in birds or life in general, which gives us a more complete understanding of the things that we're focused on. Knowledge is power, I guess, is a cliche way to put it, but the more we know on the conservation side of things, the more power we have to enact conservation protocols that would be actually effective.
You're a postdoctoral researcher, aren't you?
I'm actually a PhD candidate.
PhD candidate, I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
Bryce, what does your calendar year look like as far as your research on owls and red-tailed hawks is concerned? Is it possible, I'm asking in order for people who are watching this to be able to understand it better, how does your year break down? I mean, for example, are you blood sampling birds? Are you, whatever research you're doing, do you have some kind of a routine where you do a certain procedure twice a year, every 3 months, every week? How does it break down? What are the routines in your research?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not really a man of routine in life in general, but also in my research. The stuff I'm doing is a little unique even among evolutionary work because I work with raptors. So there is perhaps some routine to the way people go about this work that is it doesn't really follow what I do. But my year generally looks, as a PhD candidate, part of my job is I'm supported by the teaching that I do. So that's some structure. In the fall and spring semesters, I teach, generally speaking. And during that time, I'm mostly here in Ithaca at the university, doing lab work, which is taking the blood samples or the tissue samples, extracting the DNA, and preparing them for DNA sequencing. That takes a lot of time in the lab. I do get out into the field to collect blood samples often, and that's a little bit random throughout the year, especially depending on the objective of what type of sampling I'm trying to do. I try, when you're doing population level work, evolutionary work, it's important to get a blood sample from an individual where you know what population that individual belongs to. So the way to go about that is to sample during breeding, and breeding occurs at a certain time of year in most populations of red tails. So that kind of focuses my field work mostly in the summer months, but I also have another way I'm sampling populations that are hard to get to, like those that breed in boreal Canada and Alaska. I go and capture them and sample them on the wintering grounds during the winter, and then put tracking devices on them to get that breeding location later in the year. So I do a lot of trapping and deploying transmitters in the winter months. That's 2-week, 10-day field stints every so often in the winter as well. So I would say my schedule and the things that I'm focused on are pretty dynamic depending on what I need to get done.
Bryce, how do you go about capturing and handling the red-tailed hawks?
Yeah, good question. There are a few different ways, but the most common thing that I use is a bal-chatri, which is this really neat, very old technology. It was developed a long, long time ago, thousands of years ago, by falconers. And it's this cage, small cage, that you tie noose slip knots on the top of, and then you put a mouse or some other lure animal inside. And I drive around the countryside looking for perched red-tailed hawks. And when I find one, I drive past it as if I was just driving past normally. And I drop the trap out and drive down the road away, spin around and wait for that hawk to go after that mouse. And sometimes it happens right away. Sometimes you have to wait a few minutes, but the hawk eventually comes down to try and grab the mouse, and it ends up dancing all over the trap. Because it can't access the mouse, it frustrates it. So it tries a bunch of dancing around, trying to grab that mouse, and eventually gets caught up in those nooses. And when that happens, I rush up, pull it off the trap, and I have a red-tailed hawk. In other places, especially, there's these places that concentrate a lot of migrant red-tailed hawks. We use lure animals from a stationary, in a stationary trap. We hide in a blind with lure animals and traps, misnet V, and the birds come down to get the lure animal and end up getting caught in a net. And we pull them out of the net that way. So it all depends on what time of year and where we're at trying to sample things.
Bryce, do you have a background in falconry?
I don't have a background in falconry. I've always had an interest in it, but as especially when I was younger, getting into birds as a kid, around 8 years old, I was dreaming of the day of turning 14 and apprenticing as a falconry apprentice. But that never happened, and life fills up with other things, and I just never got into it. But I certainly have been around falconry a lot. I have many, many, many friends who are falconers. I did my master's with the Peregrine Fund that's full of falconers. So I'm extremely familiar with the practice and have been around it a lot. I just don't participate myself.
Now seems a good time for me to ask, as you are a raptor biologist, Bryce, and people watching this may well aspire to becoming raptor biologists. How did your own career develop, please?
Yeah. Well, like I said, I've been into birds and birding since I was about 8 years old. And that always continued and until the college years. And I started college not thinking I wanted to be a biologist or an ecologist. But throughout my college years, I realized that it's probably important for me to focus my career on something I really enjoy doing. When I was a senior, I started thinking about how to, what organizations to approach and talk to, who to talk to try and understand how I would go about developing a career in ornithology or studying birds. Started hanging out in the lab where I did my undergraduate research at the University of Utah that was more focused on the vocal mechanics of sound production in birds, which was really fun to learn about. But I knew as a birder, I was more interested in getting in the field and watching birds do their thing and interacting with birds that way. During that time, I was driving down the street in Salt Lake, and I noticed this sign on this building that had a hawk on it. It caught my interest, and I just pulled over, and it was this organization, Hwatch International, and I just walked in the front doors and asked them what their organization was about, and they took me in and started telling me about it. And long story short, I started volunteering with them, eventually got some field positions with them, and that turned into me doing field work, not just in raptors, but in a lot of different things, and eventually getting a position focused on gyrfalcon work for a master's degree at Boise State University.
How fantastic is that? I love that. For somebody who doesn't know Bryce, bearing in mind I'm in the UK, what is Hawkwatch International, please?
Yeah, Hwatch International is this organization that started in the 80s that were focused on monitoring raptor migration in a bunch of different areas in the Western US. So they started this network of migration sites where they would count the migration and trap and ban migrating raptors. That's the bread and butter of the organization today. They still monitor many different sites throughout the US. But they've also started expanding into raptor conservation work. They have people on their staff now that work in Africa and other places. So it's this really great organization that is mostly focused on raptor conservation.
Bryce, if somebody wants to work with raptors or owls, what jobs are there in the broadest sense, please?
There's many jobs. I think that I have to explicitly say, like, if anybody's interested in doing that, you just search out things and talk to people and develop a network. I mean, the more you ask people about opportunities, they're certainly out there. For people that are just trying to break into that type of work, organizations like Hwatch International have plenty of opportunities to learn, whether that's through working with their education birds, which are captive, docent work. There's a lot of that out there. But if you're more like me and you're more into field biology, you can get into any monitoring, like hawk migration site work, where you count migration or trap and ban birds. There's a lot of that opportunity in the US. And throughout the research world, there's also plenty of opportunities as a field technician to help out on research projects, gathering data from, whether that's nesting data. There's a lot of wintering ecology work as well. So you just need to know who to talk to and where to look. But a lot of that can be found by simple Google searches to try and find organizations that are doing the work and who to reach out to.
So, Bryce, your PhD research is on the red-tailed hawk, colour variation in and the eastern screech owl. What skills does a person need to do what you do?
Well, because I'm working the eastern screech owl, all the samples that I'm using for that species come from museum specimens. I mean, the short answer is a lot of skills. You don't necessarily need museum focused skills, but it is important if you're using museum specimens in your research to also be contributing to museum collections. So that includes skills on preparing museum specimens and understanding what resources are available, whether blood samples, tissues, or toe pads, and when and how to use each of those. But anybody can make a request for any of those from any institution. The skills that are very necessary for the work that I do come in the wet lab work, where you're actually taking a tissue sample or a blood sample, you're extracting the DNA from that, which takes a lot of, lab work is like following a recipe and doing all those things, but you need to learn how to do that, and you need to know what concentrations or what to use at which steps. And then you submit it for sequencing, and you get back DNA sequences, which are generally these very large files, depending on what sequencing method you use. And you take those into, you do a bioinformatic pipeline for using those sequences. And that's having a good understanding of how to use software and work with data. And the bioinformatic work operates using Linux, and so you have to know a bit about the language of Linux and how to manipulate and change different things to work with those genomic data. And then you end up with some files that you have to take into another software program, R, and produce images and do other analyses that summarize the results in certain ways. And after that, you've got to write up your results. So you have to have a really strong understanding of technical writing to produce the product or the paper that describes the research and the results you found. So there's a lot of skills you need to do evolutionary work are very far apart from the skills that you need as a field biologist, which are important for raptor work. I was going to say, because a lot of species, particularly raptors, don't have a great representation in museum collections. So you can't you can't find the samples you need to do particular things, like the work I'm doing with red-tailed hawks. So you have to go out and you have to fill in the gaps in the sampling yourself by going out and catching birds and taking blood. I have to know how to go and capture a red-tailed hawk. I need to know how to handle the red-tailed hawk when I have it. I need to know how to take a blood sample and what to do with that blood sample when I take it. I need to know what data I need to take and the organization for storing that data or those data. I need to know what permits I need. I need to know how to write permit applications. I mean, there's a lot that goes into this. And I think it's overwhelming for somebody who has never heard of any of this, but I think it's one of those things that if you are ambitious and you get in there, you'll figure it out eventually, and it all becomes second nature the more you do it.
How do you handle a red-tailed hawk, Bryce, once you've caught it in the bal-chatri?
Very carefully. I think a good way of saying how do you handle a raptor in general is you need to, when you approach a red-tailed hawk on a trap, for instance, your first objective is to get control of the feet, because that bird is the number one thing that bird's going to do to defend itself is grab you with its feet. And if that happens, it's very bad because they lock their tendons and it's really hard to pry them apart. So when I walk up to a bird on the trap, I carefully, if it's on its feet, I try and get my hand on the back of the bird and just press it against the ground so that it's not going to go anywhere. And then I can reach under the bird and get the thighs of the bird to make sure that I have handle on the legs and the feet. A lot of times, though, the birds flip over on their back, and that's a great defensive posture for them because their talons are out. And if that happens, I try to distract them with one hand and sneak around with the other, grab a wing, and then pull them so there's tension between the foot or the feet that are caught and their wing. And I'm never grabbing by the primaries because that could damage the flight feathers. Just by the wrist up here, or yeah, by the what's the hand of the bird. And then once there's tension, you can grab that leg because it can't grab you. When you're handling the bird, it's important to be calm because those birds react to, stress and tension. So being calm and moving slowly is important, but always maintaining a firm but not tight, but firm grip on their legs. I generally hold them. I have larger hands, but I generally try to hold them at the joint between their tarsi and metatarsus. Red tails don't really bite, but a lot of raptors do bite. So when you're working with them, just minding that they might grab you and bite you. And when they do bite you, it's important not to be reactive, even though it's very hard not to be, because if you pull back, you could end up injuring the bird. And generally, if they bite you, you just let them work it out, and you just slowly pull away. Yeah, the one thing that I do that helps me work with raptors is I put hoods on every bird when I catch them. There are these falconry hoods, and once you do that, the bird is in a dark space. It can't see anything, so it's much easier to work with, and they're less reactive to your movement and things.
You're bringing back lots of memories that are both wonderful and memories of excruciating pain.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been a long time since I've been hurt by a raptor, but especially in my early days, you do learn some lessons the hard way.
Bryce, did you have to have an interview to get onto your PhD program?
The answer is yes and no. getting into PhD positions in the US, for instance, is a little bit, there's a certain process to it. It's not just focused on finding a job opportunity and then like finding a job listing online and applying. It's a little more complicated than that. Generally, the process for getting a PhD position or a grad position in the US is identifying a group that you want to work with and writing a potential advisor about the possibility of you joining their lab. I didn't do that because I met my PhD advisor on a field expedition to a very remote island. I was doing some survey work out there on endemic species, the McKay's bunting. My advisor happened to be on that trip as well. We were both on a 5-person crew that spent a month on the island. So I got to know him really well. He got to see my work ethic. I just talked to him about the potential of me joining his lab. He was very, very supportive. But I did have to apply to the university, and that was an interview process.
Bryce, for an aspiring raptor biologist who may be in early career, finds themselves in a situation where they're being interviewed, what are some good questions they can ask?
So do your homework about who you're trying to get a position with, and think about what questions you might have.
What would be a good dissertation subject for the student?
I think it's important to do something that you're very into, because that'll motivate you to actually finish it, and to identify that, by the time you're a sophomore or junior, start focusing in on what you might want to do as a senior. If you're into research, trying to make sure that it's something that strengthens, whether you're into genomic work like me, strengthens your lab skills, or develops some lab skills, and doing some analysis, so it develops your ability to work with data sets, and then develops your writing ability. As a researcher, those are 3 things that if you do with senior thesis that have those components, you'll be set up really well to be successful as a PhD student. And if you produce a paper before interviewing for a PhD, you'll find that you'll be quite successful in obtaining a position, I think.
Bryce, you are a PhD candidate researching colour variation in the eastern screech owl and the red-tailed hawk. Thank you very much for being on the Practical Animal channel, Bryce Robinson.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to chat. It was fun.